everyone. Let's go ahead and jump in and get started. My name is Cindy Black. I'm the Executive Director of Fix Democracy First, and you are at our weekly Democracy Happy Hour. We're going to talk about some democracy stuff in the news, and then we have a special topic tonight on public banking, the future of public banking in Washington and beyond, with Marco Rossi. I'll introduce Marco in a little bit. And before I jump in to talk about what's in the news, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. Here in Washington State and across the country, we're all on Indigenous lands. I ask you to join me in honoring and acknowledging the Native communities in your area, elders and future generations, and so forth. So I myself live on Stillaguamish, Suquamish, and coastal Salish lands. I am going to put a link in the chat if you want to look up the indigenous lands that you live on. Go ahead and do that. So let me go ahead and stop sharing this screen and bring up my in the news topics. Just give me a second to do that. Here we go. All right, so right off at the bat, I want to talk about what happened this past week. George Santos was expelled from Congress on a bipartisan vote, even though quite a few Republicans did vote to retain him in Congress. There were enough votes, over 300, to oust him. He was immediately released. I heard the security guards were taking down the sign and changing the locks on the door immediately. So obviously he hasn't been happy about that. And a lot of the Republican leadership wanted to keep him in so they could keep their slim majority going. So there will be an appointment and then a special election to replace him. We'll see what happens. But, he just had so many ethics violations, frauds, not to mention all the other things that he made up about himself on his resume. So that happened this week. Also in Congress, former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, reported that he's going to retire at the end of the month. He's resigning his position altogether and leaving Congress, which is big news. So we're going to be seeing two Republicans, well, one, and then he'll be leaving at the end of the month, and then there'll be somebody appointed to take his position because he's not even finishing out his term. So those were the two big things in Congress that happened this week. How that will impact how things move forward, we don't know, but that's what's going on. You can see there's a lot of split within the party right now, the Republican Party, and where they want to go in different directions. How that will play out going forward, I don't know. And then I do want to mention that a couple of people, prominent people, died this week. First of all, Sandra Day O'Connor, she was the first woman to be appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. She died this past week. A lot of news stories about that. And then another big headline was Henry Kissinger also died this past week. He was 100 years old. A lot of mixed feelings about Kissinger. We won't go into details about that, but
and Jimmy Carter's wife.
Yeah, yes, and Rosalind Carter also passed away. So we had some. I didn't mention her because she wasn't directly related, but she was very prominent and a big supporter of her husband, obviously, Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter. And then let's move on to what's going on in the Trump trials. It came out this past week that special counsel in the Department of Justice is alleging Trump sent supporters on the path to the January 6th violence. And that's going to be a key piece to the case moving forward, which is supposed to start in March. So that came down. Obviously, Trump and others are not happy about that, but they are going to make the case that Trump incited and encouraged supporters to be violent on January 6th. A judge did reject Trump's immunity claim that because he was president at the time, he had immunity, and around what happened on January 6th, the judge rejected that. So the criminal prosecution will move forward. He will definitely appeal that. Will he win the appeal? We don't know. But for now, that case will move forward. He is not immune, at least for now. excuse me, it also came out, and I don't think this is any big surprise to anybody that's been following this, is Trump is going to probably use this trial, not just the January 6th trial, but the Mar-a-Lago trial and anything else, the Georgia trial, to try to challenge the 2020 election results and push those fraud claims. So I imagine we're going to hear quite a bit of that when those trials come up on the defense side. It also came out that Pence has been talking to the January 6th special counsel about all the details that happened on the aftermath of January 6th. There was also an article in Vanity Fair and in other publications that it was actually Mike Pence's son was put, because I guess Pence at some point said he didn't even want to show up to the Capitol that day because he didn't want to be too hurtful to his friend, referring to Trump. And his son reminded him that he needed to uphold the Constitution and he needed to show up and move those electoral count up. So his son really pushed him to do that, at least according to this article and others. And then a couple of things came out about the what they called those false electors and people that were falsifying the election results. A Nevada grand jury indicted 6 Republicans who falsely certified that Trump had won their state in 2020. So they've been indicted there. And then in Wisconsin, the Trump electors settled a lawsuit because they were indicted and they agreed to a plea bargain and settled the lawsuit there. And agree that Biden didn't win the 2020 election. Also, part of this plea deal is that they won't be a part of any electors in any Trump election, so in the 24 election or any further elections that he may run, say, because who knows if he doesn't win this coming election, would he run again? Who knows? And then moving to what's going on in the cases in the states regarding keeping Trump or trying to keep Trump off the ballot using Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It's moving through quite a few states, and it's not getting the results that the challengers are hoping for, though all of these cases will be appealed. They're already starting to be appealed. And this ultimately, whichever case, they'll all probably be combined, will go to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. And my guess is that they will allow Trump on the ballot. I don't think that they are going to find him ineligible under 14.3 of the Constitution. So in Arizona, a judge dismissed the Trump eligibility challenge there. Also, too, in Colorado, dozens of state attorney generals and GOP officials are pushing on the Colorado Supreme Court to keep him on the ballot there, even though that court initially said that he was guilty of insurrection, but they didn't have the ability to keep him off the ballot. Again, that's going to be appealed like everything else. And then in Oregon now, they're pushing there to get the Secretary of State to keep him off the ballot there. That will go to court most likely. And then here in Washington State, a Spokane judge dismissed the lawsuit attempting to remove him from the ballot here in Washington. So you can see there's attempts going all over the country and various states trying to keep him off the ballot using 14.3, but so far nothing's saying yes, let's keep him off the ballot, though again they'll be appealed and ultimately probably the U.S. Supreme Court will make that decision, which is kind of what we've all expected along the way when it came to this. This made big headlines. Just, I think it was yesterday, Trump said he wouldn't be a dictator except for day one. So I'm not sure if he would stick to that or not, or even why he would be one on day one. He's talking about closing the borders, drilling everywhere. Like he said, drill, and some other things. So, and also a big push is to remove people they consider unfriendly to him from government positions all across the board and replace them with his supporters. If that's what dictators do. So something to pay attention to, that's for sure. There's also concerns that Trump could use the Insurrection Act against people he deemed enemies here in the United States and actually call for military action against his domestic enemies. And so this is a Brennan Center report saying that Congress should act to limit those type of powers under certain situations. So again, that's something that people are concerned if he got reelected that he might do. So we'll see about that. And moving on to some other things around the 2024 election and voting, there's a new report out by Verified Voting talking about how hand counting ballots can be a big problem, create all kinds of headaches for election officials. It's very difficult to keep track of that. It'll take a lot more time, a lot more money. The best thing to do would be to use a machine count voting, use paper ballots so you have a record in case you do need a hand count for recounts and things like that. But if you use something like risk limiting auditing, which is one of the best auditing types of system, is what you do is after the machine counts after election, you randomly select batches of ballots in different races and you have different people hand count them and then you match them to the machine count. Here in Washington state, many of the counties opt for doing those type of things, but there's a lot of issues around hand counting if that's all you're doing, especially the time it takes and the money it takes to do that. And there's just more errors that way. If you want to read the entire report by Verified Voting, I'll be sending out the link to this and all the other links I'm sharing later tonight with the recording. And then here's an example in Arkansas where they're proposing to use hand-marked paper ballots and conduct elections that way. And the AG is rejecting that proposed measure via the hand-marked paper ballots. And this was around a proposal creating absentee ballot procedures was denied. So they're trying to use paper ballots in Arkansas rather than just a straight machine, which is the best way to go. We really think that using paper ballots and then using a machine to count them, and then you audit those elections afterwards to make sure the machines are working the way they should, is the best way to go. And in Florida, there's the state appeals court there upheld a ruling about that they felt the Black vote was diminished in northern Florida. So again, they'll have to redraw the maps there. Will it be appealed? Most likely, as most of these redistricting cases have been. And then Georgia had to redraw their maps, and they're moving through the legislature right now, but people saying those maps are also gerrymandered, and voting rights groups saying that they're probably going to lead to federal intervention because those maps will be challenged, that these new maps that are also gerrymandered, that the Dems and many of the voting rights group believe will be challenged and probably head up to federal court for a decision, maybe even to the Supreme Court. We don't know. So those maps are moving forward, but they're going to be challenged there. And in Louisiana, the legislature is getting some extra time to redraw the congressional map for their third redistricting session there. So they're trying to do that again based on a court ruling. We'll see what happens there, but they have some extra time to get that done. And then in Michigan, this is the first state in the country to do this. They will automatically register people to vote when they exit prison. So they are allowed to get their voting rights back upon immediate release, but Michigan passed an automatic voter registration bill for people leaving there, so they will be able to do that. They're working with the Department of Corrections in Michigan to make sure to get people the proper identification they need, or like a state ID or driver's license, and get them to register to vote upon immediate release. So when I read that, I go, going to bring this up at our next Voting Rights Restoration Coalition meeting to see if this is something we want to do here. And then in New York, there is some groups there that are challenging a voting machine that they want to institute. And again, this has to do with you don't get a paper ballot, so you can look at to see if your votes cast the way you intended to do in the machine. It just gives a barcode, and they're fighting back about that and saying, no, it should be a paper ballot or at least a form to show how you voted, so you can confirm, yes, that's accurate, that's how I voted, and challenge it if it isn't. Seeing a barcode, that doesn't tell you anything about that. So they're pushing back on that new voting machine there in New York. And then there's a new lawsuit now for the North Carolina Senate maps are being racially gerrymandered. So that's going back to courts, the court there around the Senate maps. So we've seen a lot of the congressional maps, and now we're seeing the state legislature maps being challenged either in the Senate or their House or Assembly, whatever they call it in their states. So we're seeing that more now across the country in various states, and that's happening in North Carolina. And in Ohio, it's looking likely, if they get enough signatures, that they will have a ballot initiative in 2024 that would address anti-gerrymandering, which would be an amendment to their state constitution. In some states, you can't use a ballot initiative to change your state constitution. Some states you can. Here in Washington, you're not allowed to use the ballot initiative to change our state constitution. We have to do it similar to the way the country, it's done federally, where 2/3 of the legislature has to pass it, then it goes before the people for a vote. For federal constitutional amendments, 2/3 of the legislature has to vote it, but then 3/4 of the state actually have to ratify it, which I believe is 38 states, if I'm right, if I got my math correct on that one. So they're trying to get that on their ballot to address gerrymandering in their state, because it's been an issue for them, as in many states. And then moving to Washington, this was a great article because we recently had Mary Hall on talking about election workers and protecting election workers. Recently, many election offices here in the state and other states received envelopes, some of them with fentanyl. And this is just talking about how election workers, especially here in Washington, are pushing back and kind of digging in their heels, and they're not being intimidated, and they're willing to just defend democracy and determined not to disrupt the process. So this is just a really great article to talk about how election workers in various counties are really standing up to this intimidation and moving forward and to protect elections. And then also, I mentioned before, we had some of the lowest voter turnout in Washington state this past election than we had in years, which is unusual because we're all mail-in, we vote by mail. It's, pretty easy. You get the ballot in the mail, you fill it out. You have like 18 days, almost 3 weeks to do that. You can drop it in a post office box or ballot drop off. You can even vote in person if you prefer to vote in person. But still, we had something like 37% turnout. So this article is just talking about various reasons why. Secretary of State and others are talking about why they think that was the issue. One of the arguments has to do with it's being an odd year. There wasn't anything big on the ballot, where in some jurisdictions where they had significant races on the ballot, they had better turnout. But there's a big argument to move toward even year elections. We recently had Andrew Villeneuve from Northwest Progressive Institute just a few weeks back talking about even year elections. And this is an article by Sightline Institute talking about that every time there's an even year election, it surpasses by far the turnout compared to odd year elections. So more and more interest in moving toward even year elections in this state and other places. And then moving to the Supreme Court, there's quite a bit of stuff going on there. They're in the middle of a session, so they're hearing a lot of cases. People are very concerned about the recent ruling about around the Voting Rights Act, saying that only the government can put forward a violation of the Voting Rights Act, and civil rights groups, individuals, and other communities of interest are not allowed to do that. That will go to the Supreme Court. What they will do with that, people have mixed feelings. Some people think that they could squash that piece of the Voting Rights Act. Other people think the court will upheld the fact that various groups can still go ahead and put forth challenges to the Voting Rights Act or under the Voting Rights Act. So we'll see what happens there, but there's a lot of mixed feelings about that. And then there's been a couple of cases. This is the Moore versus the US. This has to do with a Washington state couple that was arguing about taxes that they had on certain foreign income investment. And so it seems like, the word on the street anyway, that the court seems reluctant to change the current tax law and leave it in place. And so there was an interesting article with this headline in Vox talking about billionaires had a surprisingly bad day in the Supreme Court, talking about that most likely they will keep that tax law in place. Billionaires can't ship all their money and, outside places and not be taxed on it, and a variety of other things, because people were very concerned about how it could disrupt the tax code. So we'll see what their ruling is. Again, we may not hear for the official ruling until next year, the middle of next year, toward the end of this session, but that's kind of what they're saying right now. The court also is hearing a case regarding the opioid settlement with the Sacklers, because it was I believe, $6 billion settlement. But under this settlement, it's a bankruptcy settlement. They would pay jurisdictions and victims that were involved in this, but it prevents any new lawsuits, civil lawsuits going forward. And so there's a real split between people about how they feel about it. People want to get money right away out there to work on this. Others are real concerned that no one else will be able to push back and put forward any other claims. So right now the court appears split, but again, we won't know about this decision until later on. The Senate Judiciary Committee did authorize two subpoenas for Harlan Crow and Leonard Leo as part of their court ethics probe. So they've been in the news quite a bit in the money that they've been giving to Alito and Thomas and others. And so they have two subpoenas. We'll see what happens with that. Will they fight the subpoenas? Probably. Will they show up and testify? We'll see. And then this was, speaking of Leonard Leo, this was an interesting article talking about how amicus briefs for the most conservative issues and briefs are connected to a small group of activists aligned with Leonard Leo, who has been pushing forward some of these things and helping write these certain briefs to push back on various cases that the conservatives want to push, whether it be around abortion or tax issues, gun rights, and a variety of other things. So interesting article. This is, again, a Politico investigation. They've been doing a lot of investigative work around the Supreme Court and the money. So if you want to take a deeper dive about and learn all about amicus briefs, we've participated in those before. We've signed on to those for various issues. So is the League of Women Voters and other groups. So check that out if you want to. And then moving to some money and election stuff, Wall Street is getting behind Nikki Haley for the presidential race. And so she's got quite a bit of money coming from behind her. Koch network, we talked about that last week, is putting money behind her. And so are other billionaires, and Wall Street folks are doing that. And even Jamie Dimon came out and said he urges donors, even Democrats, to help Nikki Haley. They're really trying to prevent Trump from being the Republican nominee and pushing Haley instead. the reality of that happening, I don't know if even with this much money, if she's going to be able to move forward. She is moving ahead in the polls a little bit, but at this point, Trump is still so far ahead as the favorite. It's going to be pretty tricky. I don't think they'll do it, but they are dumping a lot of money behind her. And then this one is about Biden and his fundraising efforts. He's hitting up the Hollywood money there, and they're talking. This one was talking about a fundraiser that, tickets were approaching $1 million a piece. So you're talking about some big money out in Hollywood that is going to the Biden campaign. And then this is about a super PAC that No Labels has created to bring in a lot of money, even though they don't officially have a candidate yet. Manchin is toyed with the idea of running under the No Labels campaign and others, but they're raising a whole lot of money. And this was just an interesting article in the Atlantic talking about Citizens United and some other court decisions that may have not gotten as much attention about how these third-party candidates or this particular super PAC has been collecting a ton of money. So interesting read if you want to check that out. And then I wanted to mention this because with George Santos being ousted out of Congress, I like this article because it really just illustrates what's wrong with our campaign finance laws. And this is the headline tells it all, is like, his case just really reveals that it's really easy to abuse our campaign finance laws in the country right now, especially with the Federal Election Commission, huge backlog, not holding very many people or anybody accountable, and how they're able to get around this stuff. And it takes these extreme types of cases to illustrate how bad it is. And also too, accountability enforcement is the big, even though we have some good campaign finance laws, especially on a state level like Washington and others, it's just so easy to get away with it and not hold people accountable. So this is one reason we work on campaign finance reform, because it's such an important area. And then this is kind of connecting the FEC and what's going on with AI, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of Congress people and advocacy groups really urging the FEC to regulate deceptive and misleading artificial intelligence, especially going into the 2024 election. Now that AI is all over the place, it's really easy to create content that uses people's images, video, photographs, and manipulate it to the point of really sharing misinformation. And so FEC is getting a lot of push to try to regulate this. Will they? I don't know. I'm not holding my breath on this because they haven't been good. Kind of referring to the last article, they haven't been good about enforcement of things, and I'm not sure how good they'll be on this. And then I just wanted to point out this article. This was really interesting. This was in the Fulcrum by Cynthia Ritchie Terrell with Represent Women and Rob Ritchie from Fair Vote, talking about proportional representation and looking at how New Zealand has done it. It's kind of a series. This was the second in a series that they've been doing about that. But check it out if you want to learn more about proportional representation, which is a reform that we strongly support. And then Meta recently, this one should have gone before. Apologize for the mix up in my order here. Meta closes nearly 4,800 fake accounts in China that is trying to polarize US voters. We've seen this before with Russia and other countries, but we're going to see it a lot this coming year. This 2024 election cycle is going to be full of all kinds of things. AI, I mentioned, these fake accounts, and a variety of other things. And then now I just want to talk about some events coming up people might be interested in. This one is electoral justice in Yakima County. So if you live in central Washington, in the Yakima Valley, Tri-Cities area, or anywhere in that vicinity, this Saturday is a special event on December 9th from 1 to 3. They're serving lunch, so it's a free event and free lunch, talking about the different why it's so difficult to get good representation, especially an area like Yakima, and why reforms like ranked choice voting and proportional representation are really good reforms to trying to change that. They recently did one in King County, and now they're doing one of these events in Yakima. So if you're in that area, check that out. I'll put a link in the chat if you want to sign up for that. And then I want to mention some of the League of Women Voters events coming up. They're doing a Speak Up School on Saturday, January 6th. If you want to learn more about how to give testimony, talk to your legislators, and a variety of other things when it comes to the legislative session, this is a great program to go to. It's a Saturday morning from 9 to 12:30, and check that out. It is a virtual event, and I'll put that link in the chat. And then also the Act via Zoom series is happening again. That's during the legislative session at 10 a.m. on Monday mornings, where you can find out all various different topics around what's happening in the legislature. So check those out. Those are all free events. And then we are hosting again the Democracy Lobby Week with the League of Women Voters. That's going to be virtual again this year. And it's going to be Monday, January 22nd through Friday, the 26th. In the evenings, we're going to be having a variety of programs. And that week, instead of our Democracy Happy Hour, we're going to have a special event that night on Wednesday instead, and I'll have more information about that soon. But check that out, informational sessions and then meetings with legislators throughout the week. I'll put links in the chat. And then a special event we're going to be having at our January 10th Democracy Happy Hour. We won't be doing our regular Democracy in the News that night. We're going to be doing a special anniversary event of January 6th, where we have a guest, Alan Jenkins. He's a Harvard law professor and the author of 1/6, the graphic novel. It's all about what would happen if January 6th actually was successful. And we'll have a couple other special guests. You don't have to re-register for that if you're already registered for happy hours. But just know that's going to be a special event that night. And then I do have someone that's going to come up in just a minute to talk about an event that Fair Vote is doing. But I do want to say, if you have a chance to donate to Fix Democracy First, we're really trying to get our recurring donations up. I want to thank those on the call that have been donating on a regular basis. We greatly appreciate that. If you could give $5, $10 a month, that would be awesome. We're really trying to get our small recurring donations up. And now I want to bring up, I'm going to just go ahead and find Carrie in the room here. Hold on a second. Here's Carrie.
Hi.
I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you, Carrie.
Oh, good.
There you are. There's
Thank you.
Carrie.
Oh.
She's going to be talking about the RCV Lobby Day with Fair Vote Washington. And I'll put those links in the chat as well.
Oh, you're the best. I have them pulled up next to me, but that is so helpful. Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you. Some of you I know here, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Carrie. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Seattle in the Greenwood neighborhood, and I am the organizing manager for Fair Vote Washington. I have worked in progressive politics my entire career, and it's really been an exciting time to get to work on democracy reform to really just bolster the health of our communities through democratic change. We are hosting our first lobby day on January 17th, 2024 in Olympia, and we would really love all of the support from you all. We'd love you to come. We'd love you to be there with us. The bill that we're championing is called the Washington Voices Act. And some of you here might be familiar with something called the Local Options Bill. And in a way, this functions similarly, but it is a little bit different. In this past year, this summer, there was a Washington Supreme Court case called Portugal v. Franklin, where Franklin County was being challenged on the Washington Voting Rights Act. And they lost their case, and in the opinion written, ranked choice voting is specifically named as a remedy to inequitable voting results in inequitable elections. So now the local options bill, which it was originally a bill just to say, like, let's allow ranked choice voting to be adopted by any municipality in Washington who wants it. We don't need that anymore because the Supreme Court has already declared that ranked choice voting can be adopted by any municipality in Washington. So instead, what we're saying is we really need standards. We really need to be able to do this cohesively. Today, any city in Washington, if they want to, can adopt ranked choice voting legally, which is amazing. Ranked choice voting is helpful in so many ways, but there are no state standards for what the ballot would look like, how many candidates would be on the ballot, what are the timelines for it? There just aren't standards. So this bill would remedy that. In fact, yeah, Cindy just put it in the chat. I was just about to get to it, but VOICES stands for voting options, implementation, compliance, education, standards, and standards. So it's a bit of a mouthful of a bill name, but it really lays out what we're trying to do. If there is a city that wants to adopt ranked choice voting to stay in compliance with the Washington Voting Rights Act, they can now. And this bill will provide the guidelines for how to educate their communities and set the standards for what ranked choice voting will look like in a local election. So we're really excited to bring this forward to our legislators and really urge them to make sure that Washington stays a leader in democracy reform, that we stay a leader in having healthy democratic outcomes in our communities. And I hope you can join me. I'm seeing a question from Daniel asking if a city wants to adopt star voting, would our standards allow that? This bill is specifically in response to the Washington Voting Rights Act opinion that was written by the Washington Supreme Court that names only ranked choice voting as a remedy. It doesn't name star voting. So no.
There
Just
are
for
a
ranked
couple
choice voting.
others that they mentioned, accumulative voting.
Okay.
And there's one other one and I forget, but yeah, but star voting is not in the decision. Thank you so much, Carrie. Really appreciate it. And we'll definitely make sure to keep sharing the information about that. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Thank you, Cindy.
All right, now we're going to bring up our special guest tonight and a little intro. Marco Rizar Rossi is an organizer and director for Washingtonians for Public Banking. Marco has a PhD in political science, specializes in urban politics, American political development, Chicago politics, American politics, political theory, Marxism, constitutional law, and ran for mayor of Olympia in 2015. Marco is going to talk about the future of public banking in Washington and beyond. Thank you so much for being here, Marco.
Thank you. I appreciate being with Fixed Democracy First. I think this is our second time we've been able to present at your organization. And just looking at the names of some of the people who are participating tonight, I think I've met some of you informally in some other organizations. So I'm glad to see that the ideas of public banking are proliferating out Washington State. I'm going to start off just by putting our website in the chat. So if anyone's curious, they can visit our website during the presentation. I do have a PowerPoint prepared that's going to talk a little bit about public banking, what it is, the history of it here in the United States, different models that we have exist, and then what is some upcoming legislation that we want everyone to know about and to mobilize around, so that we can make sure that we have a robust movement for here in the state. So first off, let's talk a little bit about Washingtonians for Public Banking. This is the organization that I work for, that I'm the executive director for. Washingtonians for Public Banking, well, let me start off by saying that the idea of public banking has existed in what I refer to as the political ether in Washington State since about 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis and the collapse of Wall Street with the Great Recession. So there's been various organizations and activists who have kept the idea alive, particularly around the League of Women Voters, They were very interested in the idea of public banking. Unfortunately, there wasn't any group that was organized that was solely dedicated to this cause, and was mandated to form a broad-based coalition to have public banking legislation passed in Washington and try to get it supported at all levels of government. So that's why the Washingtonians for Public Banking was formed. It was incorporated in spring of 2022, and I was hired as a executive director in May of this year. So we're a very recent organization, even though the idea of public banking had been around in Washington State for over a decade. So let's talk a little bit about what public is. Let's contrast it with other forms of banking, just so everyone here has a idea of what we're fighting for and what are the different models that we hope to establish here in the state. So I think the way to talk about this, talk about the 4 different forms of banking that exist in the United States. The first form of banking that we're most common, people are most familiar with, that's most common, is private banking. And a private bank is a bank that is privately owned and operates on a for-profit basis. And in that situation, the owner can be an individual, they can be partners in a business, or they can be shareholders in a corporation. In a corporate setting, the power over the bank is determined by how many shares someone has in the corporation. So if I have more shares, I have a greater vote than someone who has less shares. The important thing about a private bank, though, is that they are responsive to their owners and that their whole purpose is to maximize profit. That's the whole design in their institutional makeup. Another form of bank that's a lot less common, there's only a few of them left in the United States, is a mutual bank. And that is a bank that is cooperatively owned, but it also operates on a for-profit basis. So it's similar to a private bank that is owned by a corporation, but instead of everyone having different shares of their bank and voting is determined by the amount of shares, everyone sort of starts off with the same portion of ownership in the bank and they all have equal share of it. But the bank is still supposed to operate on a for-profit basis and maximize returns for the owners of the bank. Another form of banking, which is common here in Washington State, we have some very, very robust credit unions, is credit unions. And these are banks that are cooperatively owned by their members, and they operate on a nonprofit basis. So their purpose isn't necessarily to maximize returns for their shareholders. They don't have any shareholders. Instead, what they do is they try to provide financial services for their members. And in a credit union, there are some requirements if you can join the credit union. But once you become a member of it, everyone has equal share and gets to have their vote weighs the same when they vote on the board who runs the organization. And then it gets to a public bank. And a public bank is institutions that we're trying to create here in Washington State. So this is a bank that's owned by some type of public institution, so some type of form of government. It also operates on a nonprofit basis. All the surplus value that the bank creates is either invested back into the bank or there to serve some type of public good. So a good way to break this down is this table that we've created that kind of explains the differences of each types of the banks. A public bank, like I said, is the one that we promote. It is owned by the public, or in certain situations where you can have a private bank, but the government owns the majority of shares. Because remember, I said in a private bank, voting is dependent on how owns the shares, the equity in the institution. Well, sometimes a private bank can become public just by the government buying out the majority of shares. And in that situation, even though the bank is supposed to still operate by generating a profit, those profits are given to the governing institutions so they can be reinvested back in the community. The main thing to know about a public bank, that in a democracy, when a bank is owned by a governing institution, the people that bank is accountable isn't to owners, it's not to members, it's to citizens. And those are the ones that have ultimate say, ultimate sovereignty over the bank. So it really makes the bank a political institution in a good sense of the word, in a sense that I think is in tune with the purpose of the organization you have when you talk about democracy first, fixed democracy first. It really makes these institutions democratic institutions that really reflect the values of the areas that they exist in. Another way to think about this are these principles of public banking, which is put out by the Public Banking Institute. So they say that a public bank has these characteristics, so it operates over a certain jurisdiction, territory, or nation. It accepts government's deposits, such as taxes, fees, or other revenues. And I'll explain more about what that means. But essentially, the government operates as a main depositor for the bank. It has public oversight and transparency. Its purpose is to invest in public money for social needs to stimulate local economies. It reflects the values and needs of its community. It deposits partnership loans in community banks and credit unions. And again, I'll talk to more about what that means in practice. And its profits build the bank's capital to increase local investments and benefit the public, not private shareholders, because this is an institution of citizens, not necessarily of private shareholders trying to maximize a profit. So let's talk a little bit about public banking throughout American history. It may be a surprise to some people, but the history of public banking really began here in the United States. We have a very rich history of it, even though we're one of the few developed countries that doesn't have a centralized public banking system. We have a much more fractured, semi-private, semi-public central bank system. Nonetheless, the whole idea of public banking really began here in the United States. And in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he talks about the experiments of public banking here in the United States. One of the earliest advocates of public banking was Benjamin Franklin. In 1723, Franklin wrote an anonymous pamphlet which he called for governments to create land banks, which would issue mortgages for small farmers, and these would be public institutions. This idea was adopted by the Pennsylvania legislature, and then it was also duplicated in Massachusetts and New Jersey. One of the main things that the colonists were really upset about was the authority that the king had over the legislatures, the local legislators, the legislators of the colonies. And one of the things that the king did is that he voided these public banks, which really upset a lot of people. Franklin believed that the country should create a national land bank, so a land bank on a federal level to provide economic stability throughout the countries. As I mentioned before, so unfortunately, the British Parliament outlawed these banks in 1764, and is one of the galvanizing issues that inspired the colonists to seek independence. Now, after the country was founded, we did have the first Bank of the United States, which was owned by the federal government. And this bank, which was a public bank, was originally called the American System because America was unique in the world for having such a public institution. It was only chartered for 20 years from Congress. The bank was extremely innovative from the time. It did not form a lot of the major functions that we generally think of centralized banks form today, but nevertheless, it was pivotal on pulling the country out of its debt and its major recession because the country went into severe debt to pay for the War of Independence, its Revolutionary War against Britain, to establish a republic away from the monarchy. It really needed to have some type of public institution to help stimulate the economy and provide stability for it. And this institution did that by really leading to the early economic development and industrialization in the country, especially in the North. Unfortunately, though, it only was chartered for 20 years. Congress did not necessarily redo its charter. We did create a second Bank of the United States, but as anybody knows, taking American history, that bank was eventually destroyed by the Jackson administration. Nonetheless, and during the Civil War, to help pay for the Civil War, Lincoln did establish a third public bank in the United States through the Republicans in office in coordination with Lincoln, called the Leaguer Tender Act of 1962, which created our modern form of currency that we have today. That was established in 1863. And then finally, our last major federal public bank was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which began under Hoover, but really was taken up under Roosevelt and used as one of the pillars of the New Deal and was critical in the creation of pulling us out of the Great Recession and making sure that we could mobilize the economy to defeat fascism during World War II. So even though the United States currently doesn't have a major federal public bank, we have had 4 different types of public banks at the federal level throughout our history. Now let's talk about some of the other public banks that exist today that we can draw on as models, especially on the state level when we talk about Washington State. So one of the things that's common throughout the United States are state infrastructure banks. These are banks that are helped financed by the federal government, that are helped to fund infrastructure projects. They are funded through the Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Administration. In the United States, 33 states and federal territories of Puerto Rico all have state infrastructure banks. Funding from them was available through, as I said, through the Department of Transportation. It was originally capitalized, these banks were originally capitalized in 1995, and it was renewed in 1998, and then it became a permanent funding source in 2005. It's estimated these infrastructure banks have made over 1,134 agreements worth $7.4 billion for municipal governments for infrastructure projects between 1995 and 2012. Washington State does have an infrastructure bank that it established in 1997. Now, important thing to recognize about these banks is that they don't collect deposits. What they are is revolving loan funds. So you capitalize it, you lend out the money. Then as people start to pay back the money, you use that pool of money to lend it out again. So they don't engage in what's referred to as fractional reserve, where they have a deposit and they lend out against that major deposit, which major banks do. Even though they have accomplished some great things in terms of helping up our infrastructure, as we know, our infrastructure is really lacking and they are severely undercapitalized. In total, they've only accounted for 0.05% of all spending on infrastructure in the United States. So they're a good model, very small, but very marginalized. Another example we can talk about are banks that are owned by tribal governments. So throughout the United States, there are 18 Native-owned banks owned by Native Americans throughout the United States. Half of those, so 9 of them, are owned by tribal governments, either as a single tribal government or in community with other tribal governments. All right, and either it's a private bank where the tribal government owns a majority of shares, or it's an institution that was created by the government in some other fashion. The largest one is the Intertribal Native American Bank, which is a tribal bank that is controlled by 20 different tribal nations and the Alaska Native Corporation. It was established in 2001, and it has over $230 million in assets. It does a lot of good work to help for development projects on reservations in Native communities. Another example we have too is the territory of American Samoa. So American Samoa is a federal territory. They had a major issue when the Bank of Hawaii decided to pull out its operations because it didn't find it was profitable to be there. And they had no one to offer banking services for the small island nation, which is a federal territory. So what did the local government do? Well, they created their own bank. So they established their own bank in 2012. The bank is not FDIC insured, but it doesn't seem to matter because the people of the island area have so much faith in the bank that it's able still to operate and consistent and provides banking services for everyone on that federal territory, that island federal territory. And the last example that I want to talk about, which is the major example what our organization refers to when we talk about trying to establish here in Washington, is the Bank of North Dakota. North Dakota is the only state in the United States that has a publicly owned and operated bank. It was originally founded in 1919, established by members of the Nonpartisan League, which is a group of progressives who basically formed a majority in the North Dakota state legislature by using the primary system to win progressives among both the Democrats and the Republicans. And once they did that, they were able to pass kind of bipartisan legislation to do some progressive reforms, and this is one of them. It was originally established with a $2 million capitalization, but they soon found out that was really insufficient. And now the bank acts as the main depositor of the state of North Dakota. And I'll explain just a minute of what that means. It's also not federally insured, but again, it doesn't matter because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the state of North Dakota. Now, besides the Bank of North Dakota, several states have established public banks in their history. So Alabama, Kentucky, Illinois, Vermont, Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina. These are all states that at one point in their history had a public bank, had a publicly owned state bank to help spur economic development in the area. Now, as promised, I'm going to explain a little bit how the Bank of North Dakota works. So how it functions is it takes in taxes and fees from the state. So it takes in all the state's revenue. And instead of taking that revenue and depositing in a private bank, which governments do, and then having that private bank sort of profit from the revenue, able to make out investments from that deposit, it deposits those in a public institution that is established, which is the Bank of North Dakota. And then what that bank does is that it partners with community banks and credit unions throughout the state to make loans in agriculture, infrastructure, student loans, invest in emergency relief funds, all these different things to encourage economic development throughout the state. And because of that, it's a very, very successful institution. And even though the politics have really changed in the state in the past 100 years, it still has tremendous bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. And people look at it as vital, especially to the state's rural areas, which are often very starved for investments. So let's talk about what a public bank could do here for our residents of Washington. Why do we need a public bank here in Washington? Well, Washington has a series of crises that it's about to face that we know are going to become very, very serious issues in the coming years. And unfortunately, our state legislators really haven't stepped up to the challenge of meeting those crises. So one is we have a creeping debt crisis. As this graph kind of shows, our local governments are taking on more and more debt. In the next 4 years, government debt is expected to climb from 70 billion to over 90 billion. All right. According to the state treasurer, Washington has the sixth highest debt per capita of any state in the country. With a lack of a state income, Washington's government has really limited means to dealing with increasing debt without raising regressive taxes, regressive sales and property taxes. So we really need to find some way of handling this creeping debt issue without having to resort to a tax system, which by a lot of measures is the most unfair in the country and that really burden the poorest in our state. Another major issue is our housing crisis. So we have what appears to be just a chronic shortage of housing in the state. This causes housing prices to skyrocket. Nearly 40% of the state's renters are burdened by housing expenses when compared to other states. Washington state's 15th in the nation for most expensive rent. Meanwhile, for people who want to buy a house, families who want to buy a single family home, Washington has the third highest mortgage debt of any state in the country, with over 67% of homeowners making payments. As you can see, this is kind of a ranking mortgage debt per state, and we have in this ranking, Washington has third. The mortgage of medium household, which is over 78,000, which is more than the nation, their mortgage debt is going to be over 300,000 in the state just because of the high cost of housing, because we have such a massive shortage. And when supply goes down, price goes up. So we need major investments to increase the housing stock, especially affordable housing stock throughout the state. Another major issue is our energy crisis. So in 2018, the Washington state passed a very bold law to move the state off of fossil fuels, which was the Clean Energy Transformation Act. So it required all utilities in the state to eliminate their use of coal by 2025. So we're looking at, we're end of 2022, so about a year left to do this, and then become carbon neutral by 2030. The problem with this law is that the state legislature didn't have any mechanism to complement it with major investments in clean energy production, so that we can fill the gap that would be created when we lose the fossil fuel energy. Currently, about 20% of Washington's fossil fuel energy is produced by fossil fuels, and we don't really have a clear pathway forward of how we want to substitute all that fossil fuel energy that we are currently relying on. So if we don't do this, if we don't have major investments in clean energy, there's two possibilities. One, we blow through these targets and they end up being meaningless because we didn't really invest in the infrastructure to really make them make a significant transition off of fossil fuels. Or the other possibility is we do everything to patchwork together and meet these targets, and then we have a very weak grid. and we increase the likelihood of blackouts. One study found out that there's a possibility they increase likelihood of blackouts from anywhere from 5 to 26% in Washington State. And blackouts could be a major issue, as people saw not too long ago in Texas, where they had huge blackouts for the state, and they had record levels of cold temperature, and people died, and it made a huge economic burden for the state. Another issue that we have struggling with is banking issues with our cannabis industry. So Washington was a pioneer in 2012 with creating a marijuana market. Annual sales from marijuana cover over 1.5 billion, and the industry in the state has 11,000 employees. They pay nearly 700 million in taxes and fees to the state. However, because of federal regulations on marijuana, they are excluded from a lot of the sectors of banking. So they are desperate need of viable banking services. And the banks that are willing to take them often charge really high fees because they're nervous about any consequences of federal laws. So they want to compensate for that, and that ends up being a drain on the whole industry. Because of that, a lot of people in the industry just decide to operate wholly in cash. But a consequence is that they're often targeted for theft. So in the first 2 months of 2012, there were 50 armed robberies of cannabis stores. This was during COVID, when crime really shot up, and a lot of people, because of the COVID panic, went out and bought guns, and they were really anxious about the future. And 3 people ended up being killed as part of these robberies. So it's a major issue that a lot of the retail sellers of cannabis really struggle with, and they're really hurting for access to banking services so they can get out of this predicament. And then finally is a collapse of community banks. So a community bank is a small bank, kind of think of as a small business that just serves the banking needs of a particular area. Across the United States, we've had dramatic decrease in community banks as massive bank consolidation. The Washington is no exception to the trend. If anything, we are a little bit worse than how it exists nationally. Because we've seen this dramatic collapse in community banks, one of the major consequences of it is we see lack of competition in the banking sector. So that means consumers have fewer banks to draw from, and that can mean that you have higher rates when you're being charged a mortgage or a car loan, and you have not as good rates when you deposit your money into a savings account. And that also means that sometimes people get, because the banking system is less geared toward average consumers, because there's less competition, people have less options for taking out credit cards and stuff like that. And Washington is one of the worst states when it comes to credit card debt. According to the FDIC, nearly 200,000 people in the state are unbanked. So about 200,000 people in the state have no banking services whatsoever. And we can attribute that to this decline of community banks, partially to the decline of community banks and the consolidation of just a few major big banks that have occurred in the state. So let's talk a little bit about public banking in Washington state, some of the legislation that come across, some of the recent history that we have regarding this issue. So throughout 2010 to 2018, there was a series of public banking bills that were introduced in the Washington State Senate, mostly by Senator Bob Hasagawa. Now, Bob Hasagawa I would say, is one of the preeminent leaders on this issue. He has really championed this issue throughout his career as a local politician. In 2018, the state legislature commissioned a study on a state infrastructure bank that would kind of work as was called as a financial cooperative, but just for local governments. So tribes, local governments, county governments, and municipal governments could all join this institution. There would be a public institution, and then it would go to fund infrastructure. All right. They released a study on if this structure would be viable in the United States. The conclusion of the study was that it would be feasible, but their study was very narrow in scope and didn't consider sort of the more robust public banking models as we see in North Dakota. In 2021, Senator Patty Cooter, kind of taking up the torch from Bob Hasagawa, introduced SB 5188, which would create this public infrastructure bank for tribal, local, municipal governments. It would also be capitalized in her legislation, recapitalized at $250 million, and it would try to offer some services to the cannabis industry. Now that bill got some was pretty successful in its movement. It managed to get out of the Senate and into the House, and it made it to the policy and into the fiscal committee, but didn't make it floor of the House for a vote, and unfortunately died there. Now, the most recent public banking legislation that we have is SB 5509, which again was introduced by Patty Cooter, and this was introduced last year, and it's going to be brought up again in this legislative session, the short session that we have that's coming up next month. It's just as before, it would create a public infrastructure bank for tribal, local, municipal governments. However, this one was a bit scaled back. It doesn't provide services to the cannabis industry or engage in any wholesale banking services, meaning it doesn't partner with or community banks, and its capitalization operations are not necessarily specified. However, this bill does leave the option that it becomes a depositor of local government. So local governments could join this bank and then eventually take their deposits, which they now all deposit in private banks, and move it to this institution, and then institution can lend out in infrastructures against those deposits, right? Unfortunately, that bill did not progress as well as SB 55118. So that one was introduced in the committee in Senate, and it just died in committee. It didn't even get out of the policy committee in the fiscal committee. It just died in the first committee it was sent to in the Senate. So it didn't have much progress. Now, why did SB 5509 fail? Well, it was referred to the Senate Business, Financial Services, Gaming, and Trade Committee. That committee is narrowly divided between Democrats and Republicans. It is a 13-person committee. Democrats control 7 seats and Republicans control 6. One of the Democrats, Mark Mullet from the 5th District, decided to cross party lines and vote with the Republicans to prevent the bill from leaving committee. All right. Mullet is a very conservative Democrat. He has a history of working in the bank industry. He worked for Bank of America as a managing director for 12 years. He narrowly won his reelection campaign in 2021. He won literally with less than 60 votes against a progressive candidate named Ingrid Anderson. Ingrid actually got the nomination from the local Democratic Party. Mullet wasn't able to do that because he's a much more conservative Democrat. He was out of sync with the politics of his area. However, he was able to be victorious in election basically by outspending Ingrid 2-1. So she spent $250,000. He spent $500,000 on his campaign and was able to triumph over her in those last 60 votes. So very, very slim margin, as slim as you could possibly get in the scenario. Mullet has recently announced that he is planning to run for governor, and he sees a lane for himself as winning governor. I think a lot of pundits think that his run for governor is going to be a long shot. And it's not known if he's going to give up, if his governor bid fails, if he's going to give up his Senate seat or what his political ambitions are beyond that. But for now, he's still a member of the Business, Financial Services, Gaming, and Trade Committee. And he has sort of communicated that he is highly skeptical and hostile to the idea of public banking. So let's talk about what's our organization's strategy for success in sort of the last few minutes that we have and why we want to move this forward and what's our game plan for trying to building a mass movement for public banking here in the state. Well, we are, like I said, we're a very small organization. We've just recently incorporated. We only had a hired staff this year. And one of the first things we did is we went through the people who've supported public banking bills in the past, looked at what are the strategic bottlenecks that we know will be to come in the state house for legislation, and examined our resources and what should be our areas of focus. So considering all those factors, we identified 5 main areas where we want to concentrate our energy to try to build support for public banking. And they are those are the counties of Thurston, Pierce, King, Snohomish, and Spokane. Now, I want to say, of course, we are interested in branching out of all those areas and we'll take support across the state whenever we got it. There is the Democratic Party up in Whatcom County. I recently met with them, and they are very jazzed about this issue, trying to do it not just for the state, but also for Whatcom County, to have a public bank for the county government. And we are making greater efforts to reach out to rural communities too, because we think the buy-in from rural areas are essential to getting this issue passed. And this is an institution that we think that would really benefit a lot of areas which are really starved for capital and investments. And there needs to be much greater investment in rural economic development throughout the state and throughout our whole country. But we're considering our resources, considering our areas of focus, these are the 5 areas that we mostly dedicate our energy for trying to build a movement. And we think that by doing so, we can expedite our movement toward a critical mass, which we will see catch on for a greater transformation in the state. So our strategy about this is to first connect with civil society organizations, especially these key areas, and get them to make some statements of support in public banking. And if you visit our website, you can find a section called Our Coalition, which lists all the organizations which have made statements of support and come out and had some type of way of saying that they support public banking. We consider them part of our coalition. Once we have organizations that are coming out, we want to use those organizations to start pressuring local governments. So your school boards, your general municipalities, your county governments, your port commissions, all those local governments to start making their own statements in support of public banking and to move it to a legislative agenda. All local governments have legislative agendas which they prioritize what is important to them and what they're going to lobby for the state legislature. So we want to make sure that public banking rises to the top of the agenda. I can say in this past year, through conversations with people in the Pierce County Council, they are going to introduce public banking to their legislative agenda. And we're currently in conversations with council members down in Olympia City Council, and they're going to make a statement about public banking. They're looking at making a statement of public banking and move into their legislative agenda as well. Bellingham, prior to the formation of Washingtonians for Public Banking, was a state who took a lead on this and has a resolution in favor of public banking and has consistently advocated for this on the state level. Then we want to take all those resolutions, all those commitments to lobby for it, all this stuff, and use those to leverage state legislators and say, look, there is a movement of local governments, there's a movement of community groups, there's a movement of individual activists who all see the importance of this issue. It's time that we act on this issue, create this public institution that can make the type of investments that we need to see in our state to secure a more prosperous and just economy here in Washington. So I just want to talk a little bit about our upcoming events. We do have a coalition meeting coming up, which we're going to talk about the next legislative session. That's going to be on Wednesday, December 13th. I understand you also meet on Wednesday for yours. So maybe you could hop between both groups. But we're going to do this on Wednesday at 7. We'll be giving a review from the president of our organization. We'll talk about a little bit what we plan and what our strategies are for the next legislative session. And then we do have another meeting with Senator Patty Cooter, who is, like I said, is the primary sponsor and author of SB 5509, was the first public banking bill. That's going to happen on January 10th from 6 to 7, where you're going to be able to talk with Patty Cooter, ask her questions about the bill, and get a more understanding of the specifics of the bill. So those are 2 upcoming events. If you sign up on our website as a supporter of our organization, then you can get email updates about all our upcoming events and could register for these 2 events we have. We do have virtual town halls, which we have major speakers talk on an issue related to banking or something that we think that is adjacent to our mission. And we organize those about bi-monthly, every 2 months. So we have a major event every 2 months to talk about some type of issue that we think is in line with our mission here at Washingtonians for Public Banking. Okay. So, and last one, if you want to find out more, you can visit our website. You can also follow us on X, and we have a Facebook. You can email us. And then we are also, it's end of year. We are really tight organization that works on a very, very slim budget. So we are always happy to take donations so we can keep the fight going on. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can use the time to answer any questions you might have about public banking, about our organization, and about how we're building this coalition here in the state.
And I did put some links to the event and your website and the email address as well. I'm going to start with the first question from Melvin is, why did 7 states close their public banks, the ones that you mentioned in your
So
slide?
it's a long, it's a long, complicated history, and it really depends on the state. A lot of states created public banks in between the periods from the first bank, national bank, and the second national bank, and then when the second national bank was closed. One of the reasons that the second national bank, that Jackson destroyed it, is because his vision of Jacksonian democracy really would have gave more power to the states. And there was several states that had banks at the time. So he said, well, we don't really need this. This type of activity can be taken up by the states. But over time, a lot of states ended up closing their institutions for whatever reason. Unfortunately, the feeling at the time, like the national bank, was it shouldn't be an institution that should act as a pillar of governance, like we think of a lot of institutions, modern sort of public institutions. Rather, it should be something that's chartered for a specific time and then operates, and then you don't have it exist indefinitely. So a lot of them had chartered for a set period of time, and then when the charter was up, there was a political fight, and a lot of them lost the fight. The one that I know most about is the Bank of Vermont, which is a really interesting story because it was very successful in a lot of respects. It really helped the state deal with a major economic crisis that was caused in the lead up to the War of 1812. However, one of the branches was uh, ended up being kind of a hub for corruption in the state. And that was really used as an excuse to eliminate the whole institution and get rid of it. Unfortunately, some of the people who were guilty of the corruption really were responsible for destroying the institution itself. So that's good reasons particular to that state of why it ended up collapsing, ended up failing. The state legislature ended up getting rid of it.
All right, question from Catherine. Go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I just saw it I have a 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock class that I'm taking. Anyway, I'm Catherine Lewandowski and I'm from Washington, and our plans for this upcoming year is we're going to be going around the state doing town halls, promoting our universal health care plan, and educating people about it. And we kind of believe that getting a public bank would be the perfect place to put all of our healthcare dollars when it starts going into a publicly funded healthcare system. So we would like to see how we could maybe work together. Maybe we could put in a little thing at our town halls and discuss the public bank bill really, quickly, and update people about that. So I think it's on your list, but yeah, we're really interested in that. And I'd kind of like to know what you think about that.
I think that's a great idea. We to use a public bank to help deal with, a lot of people we have medical debt in this country because of our dysfunctional healthcare system. And if we had a public bank, we could find ways to help people pay their medical bills without them going into severe debt, because we could underwrite some of the debt they take out to deal with their medical expenses through the bank. Or if we had not a sort of a state-based healthcare system, we could use some of the profits from the bank to help pay for that. So I think there's a lot of ways we could do this to help support, the expansion of healthcare in the state. I'm putting it right now. If anybody wants to contact me to follow up, you can email me at info@woffordpublicbanking.org, and I'm always happy to meet with any other groups. So I've been meeting throughout this year. I've been meeting around the state with different groups, giving presentations, talking to them. I try to get them to pass resolutions, get to support the cause. So I'm always open to meeting with other groups who are interested in this cause.
That's great. Good connection there. Robert, go ahead.
Okay, let me lower my hand first. I wrote the question in the chat, but it wasn't a complete question. Would public banking and profits from it be supportive solutions for homelessness and other problems the state is having? I see it, but I don't know how profitable this would be. And can you speak to that?
Well, I think it all depends. Unfortunately, the most correct answer is it depends. It depends on the lending practices of the state and what the state prioritizes. Now, I will say that the Bank of North Dakota, which has existed for over a century, it has never gone a year where that bank hasn't had a surplus. So regardless of what the economy doing is in North Dakota, the bank has been run in a very fiscally sound manner, and it's always managed to generate a surplus. Uh, Now, that surplus does get handed back to the state to help fund certain projects. The state happens. If the state's struggling with certain revenue, they can take the surplus, give it to the state, and then it patches up some of the budgetary issues. We could possibly do that with this institution. But another related to the issue of homelessness, one of the things that the institution can do, not just that it generates a surplus and then uses it to fund certain homeless projects, but it can make investments, help make investments into the types of infrastructure that we need to get at the root causes of homelessness. So we all know that homelessness is caused by the affordability of housing. There's research shown after study that when price of housing goes up, you see homelessness increase. And if you can dramatically reduce the cost of housing, you can dramatically reduce the amount of homelessness. It's not perfect for every situation because sometimes homelessness is tied with um, substance abuse or mental illness, and you need some more intimate care, more direct assistance. But a lot of people who suffer from homelessness, it's really just a matter of they do not have the funds to purchase some type of housing to secure themselves. Well, housing costs are totally related to the supply, and if you can have a mechanism which can generously fund low-income housing, so that when people develop low-income housing, they don't have to worry about paying off a lot of the financing, the interest on the loans they would have to take care of that issue. Well, that can really replenish the housing supply in an area and help decrease the what it costs to rent or to buy a home. Jay Inslee, I forgot the exact amount, but he wanted a extreme investment in housing as part of the legislative agenda. It was billions of dollars. I don't remember the exact figure off the top of my head. But unfortunately, the state treasurer kind of poo-pooed the idea and said I didn't think that was really responsible. However, if we had a public bank, we could make those investments in the forms of loans to housing and generate that housing production. And then we can meet that supply without having to worry about contributing to debt. Because in the long term, as people pay back those loans, it ends up being more beneficial for the economy. All right. And if we are able to offer those loans at a rate that, is a lot more competitive than what they find in the private market, so they're a lot more eager, that compels the private market to clean itself up and start offering things in a much more favorable terms to consumers and to projects like the production of new housing.
I see great questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a couple more of these. Yeah, see how many we can get to. Cheryl asks, how would the public provide input into a public bank? For example, environmental investments versus fossil fuels.
So it really depends on the governing structure of the bank. Since we have, if the public institution that owns the bank is a democratic institution, then we have say over the bank via the democratic means. So in North Dakota and other banks, there's a board appointed, but the board has usually is appointed by a governor and is confirmed by members of legislators, like other positions that are confirmed by the government. So if you did not like who ended up on the bank, the governing board of the bank, then you could make that election issue and challenge it and try to change the political makeup and get someone who would prioritize the issues that you want to see reflected in the bank, and have someone be on the board of governance that will ensure that the bank invest in the needs that you want, just like you do with any other institution, any other cause that we have in the state. Now, the particular model that's being proposed by Patty Cooter it goes even a step beyond that. So it operates through a 9-person board. 5 of those seats are reserved for local governments, because remember, it's an institution that's made up of local governments. So if a local government joins this institution, then someone who's in local government could be on that board directly and is voted on by the local governments. The other 4 seats are appointed by the governor. 3 of them are confirmed by the Senate, and then the president of the bank is confirmed by the governor. And I believe it's connected to the state treasurer, but I have to double check. But that's institution. If that institution formed the way it's designed, if you didn't like how the bank was investing in certain projects, or you want them to prioritize other type of investments, like let's say housing was a big deal and you don't think they were doing enough for housing. Well, if your local government is a member of that project, you could go to your local and say, hey, we want council member X to be it, because we think that council member X is great on this issue, and we want them to be on the board of the bank because we think they'll direct it in a way that is reflective of our community and what our needs are.
And we have time for one last question. I'm sorry if I missed a couple, but here, this one is from Randy, is talking about opposition. How do you get around the potential banking industry opposition? Because they're a very powerful industry. Are there perhaps markets that we would not be taking away from the ever-hungry private sector?
So there's a Washington Banking Association, and they have a PAC, and they defend the interests of bankers in the state. Now, I say that with a bit of an asterisk because it's kind of a complex issue, because they defend the issues of all bankers. But as you may have inferred from the presentation, bankers don't have all the same interests. There is a lot of tension between the credit unions and community banks and the major corporate banks, the mega banks, the too big to fail banks that kind of dominate our banking landscape. And so one of our strategies is to tighten this wedge between these two groups, because we really see as a public bank as being able to support some of the community banks and credit unions to the detriment of some of those major corporate banks that we think have run so much havoc over our economy. If we adopt a model similar to North Dakota, that institution partners with community banks and credit unions. So they go to the small banks and the credit unions and say, hey, we want these types of lending practices. If you engage in these types of lending practices, we'll partner you in the loan, so you can afford to offer that low interest rates because you got our back. Or if you do these loans for this period of time, we're going to come and we'll just buy all those loans off you. We'll take them off your books, we'll put them on our books, and you'll be squared away, so you don't have to worry about them. We know these loans, you may think these loans are risky because you're not a big institution and the people you're lending to may not have enough money, but we think this is important for our state. So we're going to provide all these security mechanisms to support you making those loans. Now, because the Bank of North Dakota does that, they take all these partnerships with these smaller banks and credit unions. North Dakota has more banks per population than any state in the country. And when you saw that graph I had about the decline of community banks in Washington State, so Washington State has even gone more so than the rest of the country, not by a lot, but they have. North Dakota has seen a decrease in the amount of banks with banking consolidation, has affected that state too, but it's happened at a much slower rate than it has throughout the rest of the country and through Washington State. So we could go to them and say, look, we have an institution that's willing to, the major institution is willing to partner you, defend you against the competition of those major corporate banks. You'll be able to thrive in this type of environment because you'll have this major institution that supports you to making lending practices that we think are beneficial for our state.
Great. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Marco, for that very informative and interesting conversation and presentation. I did put in the chat again, if you want to find out more information, go ahead and visit waforpublicbanking.org or email info@waforpublicbanking.org. And I will be sending that information out later tonight with the recording. Thank you again, Marco, and good luck in the legislative session. Hopefully you'll have more luck going after the different counties versus the legislature.
Yes, thank you. And I'm glad to be speaking with your group.
Great, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great night. We'll see you again next week. We're going to be talking about universal voting. Hopefully we'll see you then. Take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Cindy.